We're continuing our series in Ruth. And since most, if not all of you, have been a part of this series, I'm not going to take a great deal of time to review. Just remember, you can always watch the sermon online after, sometimes it's up on Sunday afternoon or evening, but usually no later than Monday, but you can watch it online, and that'll catch you up if you happen to miss. Guys, it's kind of blaring on me. I don't know. Is it okay back there? If it's okay back, okay, thank you. Ruth chapter 3 starts describing another conversation between Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Remember, both women had been widowed and had moved to Bethlehem from Moab. And once in Bethlehem, Ruth had been gleaning barley in the field of a man named Boaz. Remember, gleaning meant gathering up the grain in the field that the servant harvesters had left standing for them in the corners of the field, and also gathering up grain the harvesters might have dropped or might have missed. And Naomi encouraged Ruth to continue gleaning in Boaz's fields because she felt Boaz represented serious marriage potential for Ruth. Verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" Underline the word security, and in the margin, jot down the word marriage. Marriage. Naomi said to Ruth, "Shall I not seek marriage for you, that it may be well with you?" Naomi had marriage in mind. She wanted to find Ruth a husband, although she was not like some mothers who literally push their daughters into marriage. Someone said it takes two people to make a marriage: an eligible young woman and an anxious mother. That sometimes happens. It's not wrong to encourage marriage, but someone shouldn't be pushed into marriage because that could be a serious mistake. Singles should remember this: it's better to want something we don't have than to have something we don't want. So Ruth had finished bereaving the death of her husband, and so she now also had an interest in marriage. Naomi continued, verse 2, "Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative?" Naomi is acting as a matchmaker because she felt Boaz would be an outstanding prospect for marriage. And he was. Consider some of his qualifications. 1, he was single and available. Available meaning he was open to marriage. 2nd, he was loaded. According to chapter 2 and verse 1, Boaz was rich, and that was an important distinction. 3, Boaz was a good man, and he loved God. 4, Boaz was a kinsman, meaning he was a relative. That is an extremely important qualification, and it brings up the subject of a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer is the translation of a Hebrew word goel, spelled G-O-E-L, pronounced goel. And that word goel meant to recover or to redeem. To recover or to redeem. The goel was the nearest male blood relative that was still alive, and he was responsible to recover or redeem something. Notice the definition. To redeem means to buy something back. It means to acquire something again. It means to gain or regain the possession of something in exchange of payment. To gain or regain the possession of something in exchange of payment. People use the word redemption all the time, but most people have no clue as to what it means to redeem something or redeem someone. And Ian, I have to be honest, it's really coming back at me. I'm having a very difficult time. Let me illustrate something. Let me illustrate redeeming something. Now, those of us that are older should remember S&H green stamps. How many of you remember That shows you the age of our congregation. S&H green stamps were a form of trading stamps popular in the United States between the 1930s and 1980s. S&H stood for the Sperry, thus the S, and Hutchinson, thus the H, Sperry and Hutchinson Company. Now here's how this worked. That company sold those green stamps to retailers who then gave them to their customers after the customer had spent money at their store. In the 1960s, the S&H Rewards Catalog was the largest publication in the United States. Get this, the company issued 3 times as many S&H green stamps as the U.S. Postal Service issued normal postal stamps. In the 1960s, S&H green stamps were so popular, 80% of the U.S. households collected them. It was a crazy, crazy phenomenon. And Hopi reminded me that after we were first married, she would collect stamps. Customers would receive stamps at checkout counters in supermarkets, department stores, gas stations, and on and on. Now, those stamps could then be used to redeem products that were found in the S&H green stamp catalog. My mother used to collect S&H green stamps. She was a serious S&H green stamp collector. She would shop almost exclusively at stores that would give her green stamps with each purchase. She would paste those stamps in small books. And after she had accumulated a number of those green stamp-filled books, she brought them to a store. Get this. She brought them to a store called the S&H Green Stamp Redemption Center. This is a model of that store, but notice the sign. I'm serious. That was its actual name. It was the S&H Green Stamp Redemption Center. This store would then redeem those books of stamps that my mother brought in, and that meant the store would buy back those books of stamps, but not buy them back with cash, but buy those stamps back with merchandise. One more time, because some of you, this is completely foreign to you, okay? I get that. Totally get that. But basically, someone would bring their books of stamps into the redemption center, and the store would buy back those books of stamps, but not buy them back with cash, but buy those stamps with merchandise. So my mother would turn in those books of S&H green stamps, and she would get a coffee pot or a hair dryer or lawn furniture or something else. But that's the essence of redemption. To redeem something meant to buy that something back or regain that something. Now, there is a sense, we use the word redeem, for example, in a not a literal but figurative sense. Let's pretend in pro baseball there's someone who is, he has a reputation, he's a contact hitter. He's always able to get wood on the ball, very good hitter. But then he has a game where he goes 0 for 5, doesn't get a hit. And after the game, he says to his teammates, I can't wait for the game tomorrow because then I can redeem myself, meaning he can get back his reputation that he had temporarily lost for one game. So we use that word all the time. There was a provision made in the Mosaic law that if a poor person was forced to sell his property, or if he was forced to give away his inheritance, or if he was forced to sell himself as a slave in order to pay off a substantial debt, and that happened often, then if that was the case, his nearest kin or relative would step in and become a goel to him, and he would redeem or regain what his relative had been forced to sell. In the worst cases, if an Israelite not only lost his property, but was also sold into slavery because of severe indebtedness, then there was a biblical provision through that which that indentured servant could be set free. And that provision was a kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer, or the Goel, was a close relative who freed the debtor because he paid the price to repurchase what had been lost. He could repurchase someone's personal property, or he could actually purchase a slave's freedom. But that's what the kinsman redeemer, or Goel, did. Verse 2 continues, now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not a relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now, this is foreign to us, so listen carefully. Naomi knew that Boaz was going to be doing some winnowing that night. It's interesting that Naomi was strategic in going about to get a husband for Ruth. She had a specific plan. She had a strategy. And part of that plan included the fact Boaz was going to be winnowing grain that same night. After the grain had been harvested, all the grain had been brought in from the field. It had been harvested. It would be brought in to a threshing floor. A threshing floor was a large, often circular area of earth or stone on the downwind side of the village. And so the grain would be brought in and onto the threshing floor. And let me explain how that worked. The cereal crops are rice, barley, oats, and wheat. Each of them have a seed, and that seed is considered edible grain. And that seed or grain would be surrounded by a husk, and that husk was called chaff, C-H-A-F-F, chaff. The grain would be brought in from the field in sheaves or bundles. This is an example of sheaves or bundles of grain. Those sheaves would be dumped out onto the ground at the threshing floor. Oxen would trample around on the grain until the stalk of straw was ground into small pieces, and the chaff or husk would come loose from the kernels of grain. That was called threshing. But then after the threshing came the winnowing. The winnowing was done in late afternoon or evening because the breeze was much stronger at that time. And remember, the threshing floor was located downwind. This is important. The servants would scoop up the grain that had been threshed and throw it high up in the air. The breeze then blew through that grain. Because the edible grain was heavier, it would fall into a pile on the ground. And the chaff and small pieces of straw, which were much lighter, would be blown into another pile several feet away. That's how the grain was separated from the chaff and straw. The harvested grain would then be gathered together and put into bags to be sold or stored to be used in the preparation of different foods. And then the useless chaff and straw would be burned. So winnowing was just a means of separating the actual edible grain from the useless chaff. Naomi understood that Boaz was going to be winnowing that night. How she knew that, we don't know, but she did. Verse 3, she continued to instruct Ruth. Therefore, wash yourself and anoint yourself. Put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor. This is what Naomi wanted Ruth to do. First, she said, wash, meaning Ruth should bathe. Now, there are some cultures that do not bathe. Seriously. But most cultures do practice bathing. And from my perspective, that is a very good thing. But Ruth was instructed to bathe and then notice, anoint herself. The word anoint meant to smear with an oil, which referred to putting on some form of ancient perfume. It would have been the predecessor to Ralph Lauren fragrances or Chanel No. 5. Chanel No. 5 is the best-selling perfume in history, and you should know it was the first gift and first perfume I bought Hopi when she turned sweet 16. And that's how long we've been together, which is forever and ever and ever and ever. Remember, Ruth had been working in the fields under a hot sun, and we assume she was dirty and sweaty. So she needed to be more presentable if she were to meet Boaz. Understand, it is most appropriate to sometimes look our best. Then Naomi said, "Put on your best garment." And that meant to get dressed in something special. She was to put on the best outfit she had. So once Ruth had put herself together, she was then to go to the threshing floor, because Boaz had been there earlier winnowing the grain. Verse 3, "Therefore wash yourself and anoint yourself, put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." Naomi said Ruth was to go down to the threshing floor. Boaz had been there probably most of the day. He was busy in the winnowing part of the harvest. And she wasn't to let Boaz actually see her until he had finished his supper. Naomi understood that the way to a man's heart is sometimes through his stomach. So she instructed Ruth not to interrupt his meal. She was to wait until he had finished eating and laid down to sleep for the night. Verse 4, "Then it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies. You shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do." Late in the evening, that was when Ruth was there. There would be very little light in and around the threshing floor. Probably the light from just a small fire would be all the light Ruth would have. But as she hid in the darkness, she was still able to see exactly where Boaz had laid down to sleep. And that was important, because otherwise she might confuse Boaz with one of the other servants who were also sleeping on the threshing floor. And to confuse him with someone else could have been disastrous. So she was aware of where he laid down. Boaz slept with some sort of a thick woolen blanket wrapped around him in order to protect him from the cool night air. So Naomi instructed Ruth to sneak in quietly as Boaz was sleeping and lift the bottom of the blanket he had wrapped himself in, lift the bottom of the blanket up from off his feet. She was then to lay down on the threshing floor just opposite his bare feet, which could have been an odious experience, I'm thinking. Because Boaz's feet would then be exposed to the night air and would start getting cold, he would probably wake up soon after this happened. I know I would have. I mean, if my feet are cold, I'll wake up. And probably most people are like that. So he would wake up soon after this happened, and once he was awake, he would see Ruth, and then Ruth could explain to him what she wanted. That was the plan that Naomi had put together. Verse 5, "And she said to her," meaning Ruth said to Naomi, "All that you say to me, I will do." So Ruth agreed to do what Naomi had suggested, although that was going to be a strange maneuver for a Moabitess. Remember, she was from Moab, a Moabitess, and they didn't do that there. It was a part of the ancient Near Eastern culture that she probably hadn't heard about until then. Verse 6, "So she, Ruth, went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law Naomi instructed her." So Ruth did exactly what Naomi told her to do. But as bizarre as that seemed, remember, this was not, in Israel, an uncommon custom and practice. Verse 7, "And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain." So there was a large heap of grain there from the winnowing, and he went to lie down at the end of that heap of grain. Now, the word cheerful meant, when it reads, his heart was cheerful, meant he had eaten until he was full and satisfied, and he was content. Verse 7 continued, "And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she, Ruth, came softly, uncovered his feet, and laid down. Verse 8, now it happened at midnight that the man was startled. Boaz was startled and turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. So Boaz, because the end of the blanket has been removed from off his feet had gotten cold, that woke him up. He suddenly wakes up and sees this dark, unrecognizable form of someone at his feet, and he was afraid. We would all be afraid. In fact, the Hebrew word translated as startled means terrified. It means to shudder with terror. So Boaz was afraid because he didn't know who this person was. And his first reaction was that this was probably an intruder who wanted to rob him. That's because one of the reasons Jewish landowners often slept beside their harvested grain was in order to protect it from being stolen, often by the Midianites. So thinking that this could possibly be a Midianite, Boaz was startled and frightened at first. Then he sees that it's a woman, and he wondered what a woman was doing there. Verse 9, and he said to Ruth, who are you? So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing. Notice that phrase. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. Ruth identified herself. Then she asked Boaz to spread his cloak over her. That phrase, take your maidservant under your wing, meant she intended for Boaz to cover her with his cloak. The New Living Translation reads, spread the corner of your covering over me. And if Boaz would do as she requested and take part of his cloak and cover her, that would have significant and serious implications. The cloak was an outer garment. It was similar to a large nightshirt. It was a sleeveless, no sleeves, outer coat that resembled a big sack, except there was a hole for the head and then two holes for the arms. So when asking Boaz to spread his cloak over her, Ruth was asking for something special. In ancient Jewish wedding ceremonies, the groom would place a part of his cloak over the head of the bride. During the ceremony, he would take part of his cloak, put it over the head of the bride. That symbolized his taking this woman under his protection as his wife. In doing that, he was essentially promising to protect her in marriage. Remember from last time, a husband is to be a provider, a protector, and a priest or pastor, the spiritual head of the union. So in putting part of his cloak over his bride, that was essentially promising to protect her in marriage. So in asking Boaz to spread his cloak over her, Ruth was asking Boaz to duplicate that marriage ritual. That meant, essentially, Ruth was asking Boaz to marry her. Ruth was essentially proposing to Boaz. Now that, in our culture, the man proposes. Although I have to tell you, we were engaged at age 18. We didn't have a clue. I never asked her father permission to marry his daughter. I never got on a knee and gave her a ring. We just talked about marriage. I said, you want to get married? Yeah, I want to get married. Went down to, was it Hellsberg's? Yeah. Got a ring. You still have it on? Yes. And just checking. Anyway, and gave her a ring. There was nothing formality about it. And I feel stupid now as I got older and realized I did that all wrong. But I think we're still married. It is estimated that Boaz was between age 45 and 55. And so he could have been a generation older than Ruth. Ruth asked for marriage from Boaz because she wanted him to know of her desire for him in spite of the difference in ages. Now, reasonable difference in ages between marriage partners is not a problem. Normally not a problem. Unless there is a dramatic, unreasonable difference in ages, such as, Bill Belichick turns 74 next month, and his girlfriend, Jordan Hudson, who was almost 25. That's the difference in ages of more than 49 years. And people, I'm sorry, but that's creepy. One popular author, I'm not going to mention his name, but in one of his books, he suggested that on this night in question, Boaz had gotten drunk and Ruth took advantage of him. No, that's not what happened. There was no textual reason to believe Boaz was intoxicated. The fact he was cheerful just meant he felt good after eating an extremely satisfying meal, and after that big meal, he laid down to sleep. Boaz did not pass out drunk, and Ruth did not set out to seduce Boaz. There was nothing provocative there that night. There was no sexual act committed that night. This is all innocent. But what Ruth did was to propose marriage to Boaz. And it was not that Ruth was some super aggressive female. No, she had the right and she had a definite reason to propose marriage. Notice in verse 9 she said, "For you are a close relative." The reason Ruth proposed marriage to Boaz is because the ancient Mosaic law gave Ruth the right to have a redeemer, a kinsman redeemer, or goel. Elimelech, remember, Elimelech, who had been married to Naomi, Elimelech was Ruth's father-in-law because she had married one of his sons. Elimelech had owned some property in Bethlehem before the famine came and before Elimelech and his household evacuated Bethlehem and went to Moab. But even after Elimelech and Naomi and their sons had moved to Moab, Elimelech still intended to return to his Bethlehem property just as soon as the famine was over. But unfortunately, he died in Moab before he could return to Bethlehem. And his two sons inherited that piece of Bethlehem real estate. Now, Orpah and Ruth, two Moabite women, had married Elimelech's sons. Remember Mahlon and Chilion? Orpah and Ruth had married Elimelech's sons, but then both of those men died, so Orpah and Ruth are widowed. Naomi decided to remain in Moab for another almost decade after that, but during that time, Elimelech's Bethlehem property had been repossessed. It had been repossessed. It was no longer a part of the family. But according to Jewish law, that property could not be confiscated from Elimelech's descendants permanently. It could be redeemed or bought back for the family by a kinsman redeemer, a goel. Now, there are four basic things that were required for a kinsman to redeem something or redeem someone. Notice, requirement one, he had to be the nearest next of kin. The nearest next of kin, meaning the nearest male relative still alive. Ruth, this is found in Ruth 3, verses 12 and 13, we'll address next time. In this case, the requirement was that the Redeemer had to be related through blood to the prior owner of the land. And Boaz was that. He met that criteria. We mentioned earlier that he was a close relative and was probably Elimelech's brother. Second requirement, he had to be able to redeem. He had to be able to redeem. He had to be able to pay the full price of redemption. Remember that to redeem means to repurchase something, and Boaz had the financial means to be able to purchase Elimelech's former homestead. Requirement 3, he had to be willing to redeem. There had to be a willingness on his part. Boaz had to do more than just make a real estate deal. If someone decided to be a kinsman redeemer, and there was a widow involved, he would also be obligated to marry the widow that remained. In this particular case, the eligible widow would be Ruth, not Naomi. It wasn't Naomi, although she's widowed. She wasn't the person that Boaz would marry, because after Elimelech died, his estate was then passed on to his sons, Mahlon and Chilion. His sons were the beneficiaries of his estate and not Naomi. But since Mahlon and Chilion were both dead and Orpah decided to remain in Moab, it was now up to Ruth to find a kinsman redeemer to redeem or buy back her deceased husband's inherited estate. And she found that person in Boaz. So on this night, at the threshing floor, she was asking Boaz to be her kinsman redeemer. That meant she was asking him to purchase her deceased husband's inherited but now repossessed property in Bethlehem. And in doing that, she was also asking to become Mrs. Boaz. Verse number 4, requirement 4. Redemption was completed only after the Redeemer paid the full price of redemption. Had to be the full price. Nothing less than the full price would be acceptable. Now, let's transition from the 13th century or so BC, where this all happened. Let's transition from there to the 1st century AD. And let me demonstrate how Jesus Christ became our kinsman redeemer. Remember, in the original sense, mankind belonged to God. Man was God's possession because God created the human race for himself. Colossians 1 verse 16, for by him, meaning God, all things were created. All things includes the human race. All things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things, including us, all things were created through him and for him. Revelation 4 verse 11, you are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. Why? For you, God, created all things, and all things includes us. And by your will, they, meaning all things and us, exist and were created. Because God created the human race, mankind at that point essentially belonged to him. Mankind was his possession. But then something happened. The first man sinned in the garden. Remember, the first man was named Adam, and he was the representative head of the entire human race. Some would call Adam the federal head of the human race, just as the president is the federal head of all Americans. For example, if President Trump decided to declare war on China or Iran or someone, then essentially all of us, because we're a part of this nation, would also be at war, because he represents our nation. And Adam represented the entire human race. Why? Because all humans have descended from him. That meant Adam's initial sinful act has adversely affected us. As a direct consequence of Adam's sin, the entire human race was no longer God's exclusive possession. It is important to understand that after the Adamic fall in the garden, mankind became the property of sin, and in a sense, the property of Satan. That meant that in order for God to retrieve man to be his exclusive possession once more, he would need a kinsman redeemer. And that's where Jesus comes into the picture. Just as Boaz was going to be Ruth's kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ has also become our kinsman redeemer. And please notice that Jesus met the same Old Testament requirements Boaz had met in order to become a Goel. Here are the qualifications that Jesus met. 1, Jesus became our nearest kinsman through his birth at Bethlehem. He became our nearest kinsman through his birth at Bethlehem. There's so many passages, I don't have time to read them. Philippians 2 verses 5 through 7 reads that Jesus came to earth in the likeness of man. Jesus was and still is related to us because he is human. In addition to being God at Bethlehem through the means of a virgin birth, Jesus also became a man. He was both God and man. He was the divine man. And that is called the incarnation. The word incarnation means enfleshment. That incarnation meant that God became actual human form and flesh. And that made Jesus our nearest kin. He became human just as we are human. This is important. Understand, an angel could not have been the kinsman redeemer because angels are not related to us. No angel could be our kinsman. Jesus is considered the nearest kin to us because he became human like us at Bethlehem. Second, Jesus was able to redeem us because of his sinlessness. Because of his sinlessness. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21. For he, God, made him, his son Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin for us. Jesus, who never sinned, accumulated the sins of mankind on the cross. Hebrews 4 and verse 15, for we do not have a high priest, meaning Jesus, who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but he was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Do we understand that as a man, Jesus was tempted to sin as all men are, but Jesus didn't sin, not once. And that was an all-important distinction because the Redeemer did not need redemption himself. Whoever would redeem mankind would be someone who did not need redemption himself. That meant, as an example, no slave could redeem another slave. No person in financial ruin could redeem another person that had nothing, because in both cases, his need would be the same as that of the person he wanted to redeem. That's the reason Jesus had to be sinless from beginning to end, because someone who had sin of his own could not redeem another sinner. For Jesus to have sinned would have put Jesus into the same terrible spiritual predicament as the people he wanted to redeem. Former CNN host Don Lemon, one of my favorite people, is a self-professed journalist. He is a gay man, and he also claims to be a Christian. No, he's not a Christian. He's confused about that. He was raised in a Baptist church and also attended a Catholic school. Mr. Lemon has been in the headlines of late because he said he was acting as a journalist when this past month he accompanied 30 to 40 protesters that went inside City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota during a public service. And this picture is Mr. Lemon inside that church. He insisted he was not a protester, but he was just there to record the protest. That is still to be determined. But even if he wasn't a part of the protest, he was still extremely sympathetic to the protest. City's Church, I did some research, is a conservative evangelical congregation. City's Church is also a member of the Southern Baptist Convention, which we are affiliated with ourselves. But someone said to be one of the pastors at that church is also the acting field director for ICE in St. Paul. His name is David Easterwood. I have to confess, I searched and searched. I cannot find this man listed as a pastor or this man listed as a staff member on the church's website. I can't find it. He could have been a lay pastor. But these protesters were convinced he was one of the pastors of the church. And in their mind, that gave them the right to interrupt the service and protest. Here's what happened. Before the service started, these protesters took seats and were scattered throughout the church sanctuary. And so church people started to speak to them because the congregants were initially excited to see so many new guests. And no one anticipated what would happen. So the church people started to speak to those soon-to-be protesters because the congregation wanted these people to feel welcome. But then at a predetermined point in the service, protesters en masse, and we've all seen the video, en masse stood up and started screaming, "ICE out! ice out, and scream, say your name, Renee Good. Say your name, Renee Good. Adult congregants were intimidated, harassed, and traumatized. Some were accosted. And children were terrified and crying. I'm not commenting on immigration. I'm not commenting on ICE, but I need to vigorously object to what those protesters did. Those protesters radically interrupted a public worship service, and no one has the right to do that. Jonathan Parnell was the church's senior pastor, and I remember Don Lemon interviewed him, and I have to give this man credit. He was far more composed than I would have been. I don't know what I would have done, but I would have come unglued. He's the church's senior pastor, and he told Mr. Lemon what happened to them was unacceptable and shameful, and we should add also illegal. And we now know that the church is considering a lawsuit, and it should. I hope it does. A church service should be off limits to protesters of any kind. A church service should be off limits to ICE even. Don Lemon was arrested and released, but it's extremely doubtful there will be meaningful consequences. That's just how it works. I might add, the past 2 Sundays since that invasion, there has been a police presence at the church, and that's a good thing because there have been protesters outside the church screaming at congregants, calling them Nazis and white supremacists and other degrading names. Get this, and I heard this from someone who was a part of that. Inside, during the past 2 Sundays, protesters on the outside, but inside the church has been completely packed. Praise God, yes. In 2020, I said all that to get to this part. In 2020, during CNN's Tonight with Don Lemon, Mr. Lemon said to his colleague, Chris Como, and this is on video, I've seen it multiple times. Don Lemon said to Chris Como, and this is a direct quote, verbatim, Jesus Christ, if that's who you believe in, Jesus Christ admittedly was not perfect when he was here on this earth. Did you hear that? Mr. Lemon said that if you believe in Jesus Christ, he admittedly was not perfect when he was here on this earth. Wrong. That's not what the scripture teaches. Jesus was the innocent, sinless, and perfect man. Jesus lived a life we could not live. And then he died a death that we deserve to die. Third, Jesus was willing to redeem us because he loved us. The night Jesus was arrested in the garden, he made the statement in Matthew 26 and verse 53. I'm assuming you understand hundreds of men came to arrest him. Hundreds. I've heard estimates of more than 600 men came to arrest one man. But in Matthew 26:53, Jesus said all he had to do was to pray, and in response, his Father God would send more than 12 legions of angels to rescue him from that crucifixion. And he uses the words more than, meaning a minimum of 12 legions of angels could be called on to rescue him. A Roman legion was a military unit that consists of 6,000 soldiers or troops. So do the math. 12 legions times 6,000 angels per legion equals 72,000 angels. And Jesus said he could call for more than that. What can 72,000 angels do? Anything they want to. The point is, Jesus didn't have to redeem us. He didn't have to go to the cross. He voluntarily submitted to the Father's plan and was crucified. He understood he was the only solution to our sin problem, so he agreed to do that because he loved us. Number 4, Jesus paid the full price of redemption on the cross. Jesus paid the full price of redemption on the cross. I neglected to add these verses, so jot them down. Ephesians 1, verse 7. Ephesians 1 and verse 7 reads, in him, in Jesus, we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace. Jot down Colossians 1, verse 14. Colossians 1 and verse 14 reads, in whom Jesus we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. The founder of Dallas Theological Seminary, which is one of the elite conservative evangelical seminaries in this nation, was Dr. Louis Sperry Schaefer. Dr. Schaefer said that there are 39 invisible spiritual transactions that happen at the moment someone receives Jesus. The moment someone says yes to Jesus, 39 spiritual, invisible transactions occur. And one of those is redemption. At our salvation, we are redeemed. And then notice one of my favorite verses, 1 Peter 1, verse 18 and 19. Knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things. In this context, corruptible means something susceptible to deterioration and ruin. You were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct or behavior received by tradition from your fathers. Verse 19, but you were redeemed, from verse 18, you were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. It's interesting that the Greek word translated as redeemed in verse 19 is a word that emphasizes an action. Peter was emphasizing the action of purchasing something. Peter was emphasizing that the God who created us to be his possession and then lost exclusive ownership of us through our sin has since then made redemption possible through purchasing us through the blood of his son Jesus. Notice Acts 20, verse 28. Paul told the elders at the Ephesus church to shepherd the church of God, which he, Jesus, purchased, notice, purchased with his own blood. The price of redemption Jesus had to pay was his own sacrificial blood. The point is, Jesus Christ came to this earth in order to redeem us, in order to purchase us for himself. And that meant through his sinless life, his sacrificial death on a cross, his burial in a tomb, and subsequent resurrection from the dead, Jesus paid the ultimate price that was required to purchase us from sin and Satan. And if through faith and trust we receive Jesus, and if through we receive that sacrifice he made on the cross, then at that precise moment that our salvation is transacted, we are said to be redeemed. And from that point on, sin doesn't own us. Satan doesn't own us. God owns us because he has redeemed us and bought us back for himself. One of my favorite gospel songs is from Frances Crosby, often called Fanny Crosby, considered to be the most prolific hymn writer in the history of the modern church. It is said that she used over her authorship of songs was so incredible that she felt a little embarrassed because she had produced so many. So she created more than 200 pseudonyms and would not include her real name, but use those names. So she authored between 8,000 and 9,000 hymns and gospel songs. In 1882, she wrote these words, "Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it. Redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed through his infinite mercy, his child, and forever I am." The chorus reads, redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, redeemed, his child, and forever I am. So to be redeemed means that we are God's twice. Once through creation, and then second through the redemption that is transacted at our salvation. And one reason heaven is a sure thing for us as Christians is because God has redeemed us. I read about a young boy who made a beautiful sailboat. He spent hours and hours sawing and sanding and cutting and carving and painting. After he finished this boat, he brought it to the river. and attached a long string to it, and he would be on the bank, and he would just start sailing his beautiful boat. He continued to sail his boat afternoon after afternoon until one afternoon he tripped and fell. And as that happened, the string attached to the boat floated out of his hand, slipped out of his hand, and his boat floated downstream out of reach. He stood there helpless on the bank and cried as his sailboat disappeared from view. 3 months after that, he walked into a hobby store, and he saw a sailboat in the display window that seemed to look exactly like the one he had made. He examined it up close, and it was identical. He rushed up to the store owner and said, "Where did you get that sailboat?" The store owner said, "I bought it from another boy who said he found it at the river." This little boy said, "That proves it. That proves it's my boat, because the river is where I lost it. I made that boat. Mister, it's my boat." The store owner said, I'm sorry, son, but the boat is mine now because I paid for it. I purchased it. It's my possession." The little boy said, "But I want it back. I want it back." The owner said, "Okay, if you want the boat, then you'll have to buy it back, redeem it back, and the price is $10. So this little boy went home and emptied his piggy bank, and he had $4.67, less than half the asking price. So he got some odd jobs. He pulled weeds, he mowed lawns, he washed windows, he saved his allowance, and then after a month, he went back to the hobby store. He had earned and saved enough money to repurchase or redeem that boat. The owner took his $10. He went to the display window, took down this beautiful handmade sailboat, and gave it to this little boy. And this little boy said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And as he walked to the door to exit the store, he held this boat tight to his chest, as if he intended to never, never let it get away again. And the hobby store owner heard him say, "Little sailboat, you're mine twice. I made you, and then I bought you. You're mine twice." Understand that as a Christian, I am God's twice. He made me. He created me. Then because of sin, He lost me. But because His Son Jesus, through His sacrificial death and blood on the cross, paid the price to repurchase me. And because I have received Jesus, I have been redeemed. Jesus is my kinsman redeemer, so I am God's twice. The question is, are you? Let's stand to our feet, would we? And let's bow our heads together. Our heads are bowed. And before I dismiss in prayer, if you're not sure you've been redeemed, if you're not sure you have forgiveness through redemption, if you're not sure you have a relationship to Jesus, I would beg you to stay after the service and speak with me. I would be honored to sit down and show you simply how you can have Christ. And you know, there's some football game on this afternoon, I heard, but it doesn't matter. There's no eternal value in the Super Bowl, but there is eternal value in receiving Jesus, and I would be honored to meet with you, and I hope you'll consider it. See me after the service, and we'll hang out, and so I can show you what it means to be a Christian. Father, I don't know anybody's heart in this room except for mine, and truth be told, I don't really know my heart. You know my heart better than me. But if there is someone in this room who has not been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, the blood of the sacrificial Lamb of God that was shed on a cross for our sins, if there's someone like that who's unsure, they have questions, God, I pray that you will give them the courage that is needed to speak to me so we can settle this thing once and forever, right here after the service. I pray that'll happen. In the meantime, I pray, God, that this has been a good review to know that you made all this possible. Your Son Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. He met all the criteria, and I'm so grateful He did. So thank you for this lesson from the book of Ruth, the narrative of Ruth and Boaz, the marriage proposal, a subsequent repurchasing the property and the marriage and all of that. Thank you for it. And I pray we'll not soon forget what we have learned. So thank you. Keep us safe this week. Please keep us safe. Bring us back next Sunday to worship you. And I thank it all and ask it all in the name of your mighty Son, Jesus. Amen.